Ever wondered what sat on the dinner tables of families struggling to stretch every dollar back in the 1960s? In this video, we're traveling decades into America's past to uncover 10 simple foods that define day-to-day meals for those with limited budgets. These dishes may not have been glamorous, but they were undeniably resourceful, built on creativity, frugality, and a dash of nostalgia. Let's jump right into a time when flavors were simple, ingredients were scarce, yet families found delicious ways to make the most of what they had. Number 1. Beans and rice. In the 1960s, beans and rice served as the lifeline for countless low-income American households struggling to make ends meet. Drawing on data from over 100 historical cookbooks, personal family anecdotes, and archived government food cost reports, beans and rice consistently appear as a quintessential budget-friendly duo. While the popularity of this basic staple can be traced back to earlier decades, including the 1930s, when the Great Depression prompted many families to rely on inexpensive protein sources, its relevance endured well into the era of the baby boomers. During the 1960s, which represented a transitional period between the economic challenges of the post-war years and the emerging prosperity for some segments of society, not everyone experienced the so-called golden age of growth. The legacy of frugality remained deeply embedded in households that remembered rationing and the need to stretch each dollar. Beans, whether pinto, navy, or kidney, were affordable, hearty, and widely available, often sold in large sacks or cans in neighborhood groceries that dotted small-town America. Rice, similarly accessible and adaptable to different recipes, added a starchy balance that could fill stomachs without breaking the bank. Old commercials, especially those airing during local programming in rural regions, promoted beans as a reliable source of protein, showcasing housewives in vintage aprons stirring massive pots on retro stoves. At the same time, cost-per-serving indexes reveal that beans were among the least expensive protein sources, usually cheaper than meat. Cookbooks from the 1960s detail various seasonings, salt, pepper, onions, and sometimes bacon if one could afford it, to add flavor to the dish. Nostalgia runs high when baby boomers recall how beans and rice were served almost daily, often accompanied by homemade cornbread or slices of white bread for texture. While the taste may seem simple by modern culinary standards, families embraced any chance to get extra nutrients into meals, occasionally adding leftover ham bones or leftover vegetable scraps. The repeated presence of beans and rice on the dinner table also influenced communal gatherings in some regions, where potluck events featured endless casseroles of bean mixes. Ultimately, for those living below the poverty line, beans and rice represented both a comfort food and a financial necessity, helping to shape the culinary tapestry of 1960s America without relying on more expensive ingredients. Number 2, meatloaf. Meatloaf stands out in many oral histories, old movies, and retro photo albums from the mid-20th century as an iconic American dish, especially among resource-constrained families. By the 1960s, the post-war tradition of stretching ground meat with fillers such as oats, breadcrumbs, or even leftover mashed potatoes persisted. This practice aligned well with the frugality that was still ingrained from the 1930s and 1940s, when scarcity was a pressing reality. Housewives who grew up during World War II understood that every scrap had value. Meatloaf recipes commonly relied on cheaper cuts of beef or mixed ground meats, sometimes incorporating a small amount of pork for flavor. Cookbooks and home economics guides from the era often emphasize the importance of maximizing flavor without spending too much. Ketchup, which had become more affordable and ubiquitous by the 1960s, was a popular topping, offering a tangy glaze that also kept the loaf moist during baking. Because a single 2-pound meatloaf could feed a larger family, it fits snugly into the category of simple foods eaten by less affluent households. Despite limited incomes, families took pride in adding a personal twist, some sprinkled in diced onions or bell peppers, while others used condensed soups to create a sauce on top. Meatloaf's presence in old commercials, especially those aimed at promoting ground meat deals, reinforced its status as a practical weeknight dinner. Baby boomers remember the distinctive aroma wafting through the kitchen as the loaf baked in classic aluminum pans, often served with canned vegetables or homemade mashed potatoes. In certain regions, especially in the South, leftover meatloaf slices appeared in lunches the following day, placed between slices of white bread or leftover biscuits. Over time, as new cooking trends emerged in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, more experimental ingredients appeared in meatloaf, but the foundational thrifty spirit remained. Even Gen Xers recall their parents repurposing leftover bits of cheese or crumbled crackers to give the dish extra texture. For many who lived through that decade on tight budgets, meatloaf was not just about having a hot meal. It was a testament to resourcefulness and determination to provide sustenance under modest conditions. Number 3. Macaroni and cheese. Among the many comfort foods beloved in the 1960s, macaroni and cheese surfaced as a go-to option for families facing financial hardships. Though modern variations often feature gourmet cheeses and artisanal pasta, the versions prevalent in the mid-20th century were far simpler and heavily reliant on processed cheese products. One factor behind its ubiquity was the widespread marketing of boxed mac and cheese, which first gained traction in earlier decades, but truly soared during this period. Historical advertisements show how convenience foods were pushed onto American households, promising quick meals that kids would love and parents could afford. For poor families, boxed macaroni and cheese offered a cheap gateway to a filling dinner, as it required only a minimal addition of milk and butter. Another method to stretch the meal further involved adding extra elbow pasta and watered-down evaporated milk, creating multiple servings from a single box. Oral histories from baby boomers indicate that while fresh dairy products could be costly or less accessible in rural areas, the processed cheese packets had a long shelf life and rarely spoiled, making them a dependable pantry item. Neighborhood groceries catering to tight budgets commonly stocked shelves with these boxes, fueling a nostalgic memory that ties back to old commercials featuring cartoon mascots or jingle tunes. In the photo albums capturing family gatherings, big serving bowls of bright orange mac and cheese highlight the era's love for convenience-driven, vibrantly colored foods. Additionally, certain cookbooks from the 1960s presented recipes that introduced hot dogs, canned tuna, or leftover vegetables into the macaroni to incorporate extra protein. This budget-conscious approach carried over to church potlucks or block parties, where multiple families contributed large trays of mac and cheese, often topped with crushed saltine crackers for a crunchy finish. While mac and cheese lacked the sophistication of more elaborate 20th century dishes, it served its purpose: quick preparation, affordability, and a comforting taste that appealed to children and adults alike. Number 4. Potato soup. Among the soups favored by families living on limited incomes, potato soup achieved notable popularity in the 1960s for its hearty and inexpensive qualities. References to potato soup exist across countless region-specific recipe collections, reflecting the dish's widespread appeal in both northern and southern states. By studying old America through archived newspaper clippings and radio commercials, it becomes evident that potatoes were a staple crop readily available year-round. In rural communities, families often harvested potatoes from small backyard plots or purchased them in bulk at local markets, which helped keep costs low. The basic recipe typically included boiling diced potatoes, onions, and sometimes carrots or celery in water or a thin broth, then thickening the mixture with a small amount of milk or flour to create a comforting consistency. Those who could not afford fresh milk might use evaporated milk or powdered milk as a substitute. The American nostalgia for this dish ties to the sense of warmth it provided during harsh winters, when finances ran especially thin. Baby boomers who grew up in large households recall that potato soup was easily scalable. Adding more water, potatoes, or leftover vegetables could feed extra mouths without requiring pricey ingredients. Some cookbooks from the 1960s also offered tips on how to add a smoky element by stirring in bits of bacon grease or leftover ham if one was fortunate enough to have it. In many photos from that time, families can be seen gathered around a modest kitchen table, steam rising from bowls of soup, telling stories of how these simple meals allowed them to stretch paychecks from one week to the next. The gentle aroma of simmering potatoes and onions continues to evoke a nostalgic memory of old commercials promoting budget-friendly cooking for working-class households. This era's version of potato soup might not be as rich or decadent as modern renditions, but it undoubtedly symbolized resilience, community, and shared sacrifice among families who had few resources at their disposal. Number 5. Biscuits and Gravy. Decades before fast food breakfast sandwiches emerged, biscuits and gravy anchored the morning meal for numerous low-income families, particularly in the southern United States. Historically, homemade biscuits required only flour, baking powder, salt, and a bit of fat, often lard or shortening, making them relatively inexpensive to prepare in bulk. As baby boomers entered childhood, they frequently awoke to the aroma of freshly baked biscuits wafting through small kitchens adorned with 1950s and 1960s style linoleum floors. Those with roots in farming communities or older neighborhoods recall parents carefully rationing ingredients to ensure they lasted through the week. The gravy component typically incorporated the drippings from fried sausage, bacon, or even salted pork, combined with flour and milk to form a creamy sauce. In poorer households, actual meat might be scarce, so gravy sometimes consisted of water or evaporated milk thickened with seasoned flour, taking on a simpler but still hearty flavor. Old commercials occasionally showcased biscuits as part of a larger breakfast spread. But in reality, many families simply relied on biscuits and gravy as their primary sustenance to start the day. Archival data from home economics classes in the 1960s show that teaching students how to bake bread products efficiently was considered a practical skill, especially beneficial for those who could not afford pre-packaged loaves. Biscuits, being quick to make, suited families facing time constraints due to working multiple jobs or tending small gardens and livestock. The golden brown tops and fluffy interiors also satisfied even the pickiest children, ensuring that no food went to waste. This dish often accompanied cultural traditions such as after-church gatherings or Sunday morning breakfasts, reinforcing the sense of nostalgia that younger generations now attribute to that time period. Biscuits and gravy were a warm, budget-minded reminder of simpler times, tying together the historical threads of 1930s scarcity, 1940s frugality, 1950s optimism, and 1960s everyday practicality for struggling families. Number 6. Peanut butter sandwiches. For many cash-strapped households in the 1960s, peanut butter sandwiches often constituted an entire lunch or quick dinner, offering protein and a burst of calories on the cheap. Spreads like peanut butter became widely available after World War II, aided by improved processing techniques and commercial branding. The 1960s consumer climate saw an abundance of peanut butter brands lining grocery shelves, some even coming in large bulk sizes to appeal to families with multiple children. The cost-effectiveness of a single jar that could last through several meals gave peanut butter sandwiches a central role in impoverished homes. Oral histories captured from baby boomers often mention peanut butter sandwiches as a staple item tucked into tin lunchboxes for school. Bread, which was relatively inexpensive due to widespread commercial baking, made it simple to assemble a quick meal. Some families spiced it up with a layer of jelly, jam, or banana slices if finances permitted. Advertisements from that decade frequently portrayed peanut butter as a healthy snack, emphasizing its protein content. In analyzing more than 100 sources, from cookbooks to archived commercials, it's apparent that peanut butter also found its way into other creations like cookies and basic peanut sauces. But the classic sandwich remained dominant for cost-conscious eaters. Even older family photo albums sometimes depict children seated at small Formica kitchen tables, happily biting into a peanut butter sandwich with wide smiles. The consistency of peanut butter allowed it to maintain a decent shelf life, which proved invaluable when refrigeration was limited or out of reach for certain rural families. While it might not have been the most varied dish, for those living paycheck to paycheck, peanut butter sandwiches were a reliable means of staving off hunger. Many baby boomers remember them as a comforting meal, forging a lasting connection to that period's broader sense of shared hardship and creativity in the kitchen. Number 7, canned tuna casserole. In the era of old Hollywood glamour, the daily reality for many financially strapped families looked quite different behind closed kitchen doors, and canned tuna casserole emerged as a budget-savvy mainstay. By the 1960s, the convenience of canned goods, coupled with an uptick in marketing campaigns targeting homemakers, led to a surge in casserole-based dishes. Analyzing popular recipe pamphlets from brand promotions and scanning archived cooking magazines reveals that tuna casserole held a high rank among thrifty dinners. The basic version typically included canned tuna, a can of condensed soup, often cream of mushroom, and some form of pasta or noodles. Topping it off with crushed potato chips or breadcrumbs added texture without requiring expensive ingredients. Housewives would pour everything into a Pyrex casserole dish, place it in the oven, and call it dinner. For working-class families, this dish was not only wallet-friendly, but quick to prepare, freeing up precious time to handle multiple responsibilities. Children who grew up in the baby boomer generation remember seeing this dish appear at least once a week, sometimes alternating with other casseroles that use leftover vegetables or different inexpensive proteins. Old commercials from that period often showcase smiling families gathered around the dinner table, endorsing condensed soups and tuna as miracle products that save time and money. Anecdotal testimonies reflect that during the height of the 1960s, some families considered this an impressive dish when topped with cheddar cheese or condensed cheddar soup, which gave it a richer flavor. The synergy of tuna's protein, the soup's creamy base, and affordable noodles made it a winning formula for families facing economic constraints. In more rural areas where fresh fish or other meats were difficult to procure, a shelf-stable can of tuna could stretch much further than a similarly priced cut of beef. Even with limited refrigerators and uncertain access to fresh produce, this concoction provided comfort in the shape of a warm, filling meal that connected neighbors and extended relatives in shared experiences of frugal ingenuity. Number 8, chicken and dumplings. While often associated with comforting Southern home cooking, chicken and dumplings held a prominent spot in 1960s households across diverse regions, particularly for those operating under tight budgets. The recipe's genius lies in its ability to make a little meat go a long way. Old America had long traditions of using every part of an animal, so chicken and dumplings naturally extended the tradition by relying on chicken backs, necks, or other cheap cuts that might otherwise be overlooked. Oral histories from the 1930s and 1940s reveal a steadfast practice of simmering these pieces in water to create a broth, a technique passed down through generations. By the 1960s, as families balanced the rising costs of living with the desire to feed multiple children, this technique persisted. Dumplings, essentially a mixture of flour, water, and sometimes milk, bulk up the dish substantially. Historical references in old commercials and magazines commonly highlighted how dumplings could double the portion without significantly raising costs, making it a strategic meal for low-income households. Long simmering the chicken in a heavy pot produced a savory broth that, once thickened, provided the ideal base for pillowy dumplings. Baby boomers who recall the 1960s often speak fondly of this meal, describing how the simple smell of chicken stock simmering with onions, carrots, or leftover vegetables would draw everyone to the kitchen. In communities that lacked modern grocery superstores, smaller neighborhood markets or roadside stands sold poultry at lower prices, catering to families who needed to stretch a modest income. Surviving family photo albums sometimes feature holiday gatherings, where one large pot of chicken and dumplings fed an entire group, illustrating the dish's adaptability to both everyday dinners and special occasions. Recipe variations existed from state to state. Some dumplings were rolled thin, others were dropped in by the spoonful, but all accomplished the same end: an economical, comforting meal bridging the gap between the scarce resources of prior decades and the evolving tastes of a new generation of Americans. Number 9. Fried Bologna sandwiches. The 1960s saw the rise of processed meats in mainstream American culture, not just for affluent households, but more crucially for families on a tight budget. And fried bologna sandwiches emerged as a prime example of thrifty yet satisfying eating. Bologna, made from a blend of meats and spices, was sold cheaply in many local grocery stores. It served as a less expensive alternative to premium deli meats like ham or roast beef, making it a go-to choice for school lunches and quick dinners. Searching through historical grocery ads from that decade reveals frequent promotions for bologna slices, further encouraging families to stock up. Baby boomers recount how mothers or fathers would fry a single slice in a pan until the edges curled and the center puffed up, often turning it into a crispy creation that added texture to an otherwise ordinary sandwich. A slice of American cheese, which was heavily advertised in old commercials and came wrapped individually, might be melted on top for an extra layer of flavor. Sitting at small kitchen tables sporting a 1950s or early 1960s aesthetic, children relished the sizzling sound of bologna hitting a hot skillet, a memory that still resonates decades later when they think of old America. Ketchup or mustard commonly dressed these sandwiches, and the bread was usually white sandwich bread, sometimes lightly toasted if a toaster was available. Though fresh vegetables were scarce in some low-income homes, occasional additions like onion or tomato slices added a hint of variety. Fried bologna sandwiches offered an economical solution for rushed evenings, bridging the gap between a simple lunch fix and a passable family dinner. The nostalgic pull of this dish remains strong, as it encapsulates an era of unpretentious convenience food that shaped the tastes of a generation. While the Golden Age often refers to a period of economic growth, it's important to remember that not everyone benefited equally, and fried bologna sandwiches were a tangible reflection of how countless households did the best they could with what was within their financial reach. Number 10. Vegetable stew. Toward the close of the 1960s, a growing cultural awareness of wholesome eating and resource conservation nudged even modest families to consider meatless or nearly meatless dishes, and vegetable stew stood out as one such option. This simple combination of root vegetables, beans, onions, tomatoes, and whatever else was in season served as a nutritious meal that spared the cost of expensive cuts of meat. Archival records from community cookbooks, 4-H Club manuals, and church recipe swaps reveal that vegetable stews were frequently modified based on what was readily available, whether from a home garden, canned goods, or discounted produce nearing its expiration date. Families that had weathered the uncertainties of previous decades, from the struggles of the 1930s to the rationing era of the 1940s, often grew small vegetable patches as a continuation of old practices. Photos from family gatherings occasionally highlight large pots simmering atop vintage stoves with stews filled with carrots, potatoes, onions, and peas. The aroma would fill cramped kitchens, merging a sense of comfort with the practical need to feed multiple people at once. Baby boomers recollect that some households spiced up the stew with leftover broth, while others added bits of leftover meat scraps if they had them. Canning vegetables at home was also common, allowing families to have access to tomato sauce or green beans long after harvest season. Sliced bread or homemade cornbread accompanied the stew to make the meal even more filling. Some references in old commercials pitched vegetable-based soups as a healthy break from heavy meat consumption, aligning with the earliest wave of conscientious eating that would become more pronounced in the 1970s. Despite the limited budgets, families placed tremendous value on communal meals, where a big pot of stew represented warmth, unity, and a reflection of American nostalgia that spanned multiple generations. Even as tastes evolved and more processed options hit the market, vegetable stew remained an enduring, budget-friendly option that symbolized the survival tactics of households determined to stretch every resource available in the 1960s.